Hi, everyone. My name is Philip Bloom. I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies at the Huntington. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture, Stranger in the Shogun City, A Japanese Woman and Her World, by Dr. Amy Stanley, Professor of History at Northwestern University. I'd like to thank the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for underwriting all of our East Asian garden lectures. So despite the unrelenting pandemic, this fall has actually been a very exciting time for the Huntington's Asian Gardens. As many of you know, the third phase of our Chinese garden opened to the public on October 9th, and that brought to near completion a master plan that was developed nearly 20 years ago. But at the same time, we've also begun quietly working on a new project in the Japanese garden, the reconstruction of a 300-year-old house from Marugame, a small city on the island of Shikoku. The house belonged to a single family who long served as the heads of their village, but who have now entrusted the house to the Huntington, where it will be preserved and shared with a broader public than might visit Marugame. For generations, the house was the center of village life. It functioned as everything from a tax depot to a site for community celebrations. And at the Huntington, it actually will become the centerpiece of new programs centered on horticultural and to a certain extent agricultural sustainability. And those programs will extend across all of our gardens. The concrete foundations for what we're calling the Japanese Heritage House have now been poured, and we're eagerly awaiting a team of carpenters from Japan to begin reassembling the house on site. So as we continue working on this house over the next couple of years, we're looking forward to a series of lectures and symposia that will provide insights into Japanese life from the 17th to 19th centuries, so that period during which this house was at its most active. We're thrilled that today's speaker, Professor Amy Stanley, has agreed to inaugurate this series of lectures. Professor Stanley received her PhD in East Asian languages and civilizations at Harvard in 2007, and she's a specialist in Japan's Edo period. She has a particular commitment to reconstructing the lives of early modern women, and she's been an inspiring advocate for contemporary women, particularly junior scholars working in the field of Japanese studies. Professor Stanley is the author of Selling Women, Prostitution, Households, and the Market in Early Modern Japan, which was published by the University of California Press in 2012, and which brilliantly shows how paying attention to the experiences of women actually completely reshapes conventional scholarly understandings of foundational institutions like markets or status systems, households, and more. Her articles have appeared in a wide variety of publications, and she's held fellowships from the Japan Foundation, the Japan-US Friendship Commission, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. But Professor Stanley's most recent publication is the subject of her talk today, Stranger in the Shogun City, A Japanese Woman and Her World, which was published by Scribner just earlier this year. It's a book that reconstructs the life of an irrepressible woman, and you'll see why she was irrepressible in a few moments, named Tsuneno, who made her way from a farming village in northern Japan to the capital city of Edo in the first half of the 19th century. It's based on hundreds of archival research, as well as Professor Stanley's many years of research into Edo period history more generally. And it renders just an amazingly vivid, detailed depiction of commoners' lives at the time. But simultaneously, Professor Stanley is able to weave the tale of this protagonist into a macro-historical narrative that literally begins with John Adams in the White House and ends with the construction of one of Tokyo's newest subway lines. But importantly too, the book is accessible. It really reads like a novel, although it's a novel whose every detail is supported by citations of primary sources and scholarship. It's so rare that scholars seek to engage the public through their publications. And so I think I speak for all of the book's readers in feeling profound gratitude to Professor Stanley for choosing to share this remarkable story with us. As Jordan said throughout the talk, please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A box that appears either at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. And at the end of Professor Stanley's talk, I will pose those questions to her. So please join me in welcoming Professor Amy Stanley.
Thank you, Philip. That was such a lovely introduction. I am so moved. I want to also thank all of you for being here virtually to hear me talk about my book, Stranger in the Shogun City, which came out from Scribner in July. I really wish that I could be with you in California, particularly in your lovely Japanese garden, but I can't wait to visit when the pandemic is over and when I can finally see this glorious Japanese house that's going to be constructed there. I'm intensely interested in it, so I know I will be back. So to begin today with my lecture, let me just share my screen. Here it is. I want to take you back in time. And I'm not going to take you to the 19th century, although we're going to get there eventually. Instead, I'm going to take you someplace a little more recent. That is around the year 2009, when I was starting out as an assistant professor at Northwestern. I was teaching for the first time my favorite subject, which is the history of early modern Japan. That's what we used for the period between 1600 and 1868, which is sometimes called the Edo period, sometimes called the Tokugawa period. And I had all these eager students ready to learn. And I realized that I didn't have enough to assign them about everyday life among kind of ordinary people. And that's what I'm always most interested in, is kind of common people and how they navigate historical change. And so I was really excited, but I was worried about what I was going to assign. And I started looking around on the websites of prefectural archives in Japan, looking for documents about everyday life that I could translate and assign to my students so they could read these things and get an idea of how archival research in Japan might look. So I was looking around on the internet and I landed on the webpage of the Nigata Prefectural Archives, which is, you can see right here, this is a screenshot of their webpage. And down here, I found this little place called the Internet Komonjo Koza, which is the Internet Document Reading Course. And this was a place on the website where the archive, which had a public mission, introduced their documents to the public with the idea that people would see some of these interesting documents and come in to see them for themselves and then engage with the educational resources of the archive. So Niigata, where this archive is located, is this city over here on the coast of the Sea of Japan. You can see Tokyo down here. Today on the bullet train, it takes about 2.5 hours to get back and forth from Tokyo to Niigata. So I was sitting in my office here in Evanston, Illinois in 2009, looking at the webpage of the Nigata Prefectural Archives, and I clicked on this document reading course, and I was idly looking through it when I clicked on episode 12 of this document reading series, and I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a letter from a woman named Tsuneno, who was living in Edo, which was the old name for the city that we now know as Tokyo, in 1840. And it was addressed to her mother in the countryside. This is what this letter looks like. Luckily, there was a transcription, which I could read, because this, when I was starting out, looked like script me. And from that transcription, I was able to make a rough translation, which you can see here. This is the first part of the letter, which I translated. And this letter began, "I'm writing with spring greetings. As you know, I went to Kanda Minagawa-cho in Edo quite unexpectedly, and I ended up in so much trouble." The letter went on in a style that was shockingly vivid and almost contemporary. So she talked about her boss, this wealthy merchant who was building a villa for his concubine. She dropped a reference to a famous kabuki actor, and she recommended a certain type of hair oil, which she sent home for her sister-in-law. And she wrote that the food here is great. Everything I eat is delicious. And for some reason, this is the line that really grabbed me out of all of them, because it reminded me of myself when I was a college sophomore and went to Tokyo for the first time. I could have written that exact sentence. Everything in Tokyo really still is delicious. So even before I knew the rest of the story about this woman, I fell in love. The archive provided a brief synopsis of Tsuneno's life story, that she'd been divorced and run away from her village, that she had ultimately ended up in the service of a famous Edo samurai, and it also revealed that it contained dozens of letters about her in its collection. So I flew to Japan as soon as I could. I took that train to Niigata, and I spent days in the archive taking pictures of what turned out to be hundreds of documents. But even I, at that point, had to wonder what it was I thought I was doing. The problem was that the original document I read online was transcribed, and that's how I produced this translation. I was able to read it. But when the documents were not transcribed, when they were in the original handwriting, as I said, it looked like squiggles. So I could read the transcription, which had normal looking Japanese characters, because I could read ordinary 19th century Japanese in printed form, but I just could not decipher these squiggles. Also, as I was soon to learn, many of these letters were in dialect, and I had absolutely no idea what they might be saying. In fact, I could not even imagine what they could possibly be saying. Everything was to me meaningless. So I stood there and I thought to myself that I was wasting my time, and that even more importantly, I was wasting my research funding. But I'd gone all the way there, so I just stood in this archive taking photo after photo, feeling kind of hopeless about the whole thing. Over the next few years, I was teaching full time, and I also had 2 babies. So I was very busy, but the voice in that original letter just wouldn't let me go. I returned to the letters over and over again, trying to teach myself how to read Tsuneno's handwriting and trying to sound out every word. This is a picture of my younger son, Henry, when he was probably 2 years old, with my Japanese character dictionary. This is the dictionary that you use to look up all these squiggles. It was very well used by that point. It was dropping pages all over my house. And I like to show this because this gives you some idea of what my life was like in those years as I was trying to decipher these letters. I traveled to Nigata to visit the archive again almost every year, and in each trip I photographed more material, and there were many types of things that I ended up encountering. So there were letters which look like this, and this gives you an idea of the kind of range of handwriting that one can encounter in these letters. If you can read Japanese, you'll notice that these are quite different. I also found household diaries and records of expenses, these from a somewhat later period. I also found inventories and shopping lists where things were enumerated. And I also found things like maps, which were colorful and much bigger than the other documents. The letters themselves could stretch across an archive table because they were folded accordion style. And when you unwrapped them, they would be almost sometimes the length of my arm span. So after photographing all of these materials and trying to puzzle out what they might meant, I realized I needed to hire a research assistant to get started on some of the transcriptions for me. So I got the first 10 or so done that way. I wore out a series of dictionaries. This is the one that I showed you from before, completely taped up next to my sleeping dog. I can't throw this one out because it has an inscription on it. It was given to me by my first professor of Japanese history in Japan. So it's a very treasured object, one of the things that I would grab from my house if we had a fire. So I was trying in these years as hard as I could to learn Tsuneno's story, to retrace her steps, and to understand her motivations. And I wrote compulsively, sometimes on my phone while rocking babies to sleep, or in the middle of chaotic birthday parties. And I felt like I was being haunted by a stubborn, obsessive 19th century ghost. Now, the question really is, was Tsuneno the obsessive ghost, or was I the one who was being obsessive? I think that's still kind of an open question all these years later. But the result of that 10 years of research and that obsession is the book that I'm talking about today. I forgot to show you this picture. This is me in Tsuneno's old village, Ishigami. It's now part of the city of Joetsu. It's now just kind of an intersection sign. You can say that it says Ishigami. This is where I did part of the research to kind of figure out what her world looked like. So the book tells the story of Tsuneno, this woman, but it's also a story about Japan in the first half of the 19th century. It's a book about how ordinary women struggle to make their own lives, to break from what's expected. And recently I've come to realize that it's also about what it feels like to live at a time when it seems like the world you've known all your life, that your parents and your grandparents have known, might be ending. Tsuneno was born in 1804, and she died in 1853, the same year that the American Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships sailed into Edo, and changed Japan forever. Tsuneno came from a tiny village called Ishigami. And here we can see it on this map that I made. So here's the city of Nigata, which I told you before, which is where the archive was, but actually where she was from was quite far away. So this little village called Ishigami, which is in the, on a plain near the mountains in Kubiki County, and near the castle town of Takada. Ishigami was the kind of place where people spent the winters inside, huddled in smoky, dimly lit rooms, the kind of place where the wind whipped the snow across the rice fields so fast that it could be impossible to find your way. The old people said that it was freezing from equinox to equinox, and during the long winters, it was difficult for letters and packages to get in or out. Horses couldn't be used because they could get stuck up to their bellies in sudden snowdrifts. And if a special message from the shogun came through, peasants had to be sent out in flat, heavy shoes to stomp down the snowdrifts and make the highways passable. This is an image from a book that was published in Tsuneno's time. It's called Hokuetsu Seppu, by a writer who was from her region. His name was Suzuki Bokshi. And part of his aim in writing this book was to explain the manners and customs of the snow country, of his part of Echigo, to an audience of people in Edo, which is now Tokyo, who were city people in a much better climate, who had no idea what it was like to live through these snowy winters. And so he depicted things like the shovels that people used and the snowshoes that they had to put on, and all the work that they had to do to clear their snowdrifts. So this was a place where life was certainly very difficult for the vast majority of people. But Tsuneno's father, whose name was Emon, was the head priest at a village temple, at a Buddhist temple in Ishigami, and that temple is called Rinsenji. And because her family had this elevated status in the temple and in the village, Tsuneno was fortunate to have a much easier life than most of her neighbors. Her family was prosperous. They collected contributions from their work as Buddhist priests, and they also lent money to nearby peasants. So Tsuneno had a life much like that of any other well-bred girl in Japan's snow country. She learned to read and write alongside her older brother, Gyu. She learned to sew. She learned the contours of her village, the trees in the forests, the ducks on Big Pond. In the winter, she learned to build snow forts and to walk in snowshoes, and to climb to the tops of the mounds of snow that people used to pile up in the streets and courtyards, because they had to go up every night and clear the snow off the rooftops, because otherwise the accumulated weight of that snow would collapse their houses. And Tsuneno also learned what would be expected of her in the future. As the popular didactic text for women called The Greater Learning for Women said, to be a woman is to leave home and get married. It admitted no other possibility. And when Tsuneno was only 12 years old, this is exactly what happened to her. She was sent away with a huge trousseau to the distant northern province of Dewa. So this is the map that actually appears in my book. And you can see that Kubiki County, where Tsuneno is originally from, is here in Niigata, and she was sent all the way up here at the age of 12 to the town of Oishida in Dewa province. She was going to be married to a man that she had never met. He lived in this town, Oishida, where he had a Buddhist temple. So he had a life much like her family's life, just a kind of larger town in a slightly more prosperous and happening place. The town of Oishida was known for the trade in safflowers. People didn't grow these safflowers in Oishida, but in the countryside around it. And they would spend all year cultivating these safflowers, which they would pick in the early summer, and which were then processed into dye, the red dye that became lipstick, or the red dye that would dye fine clothes in the emperor's capital of Kyoto. This was not a bad situation for Tsuneno. It was the best her parents could do. It was a prosperous temple in a medium-sized town. And amazingly, that temple is still there, and I was able to go and visit it on one of my trips. The original structure has been rebuilt, but you can see these original gravestones and the storehouse and the bell, and get a sense a little bit of what this region might have been like for her in the early 19th century. But that first marriage that Tsuneno made lasted only 15 years, and then she was sent home with a letter of divorce. The divorce was amicable. Her husband remained friendly with her family, but it was a definite ending. Tsuneno by then had lived in Oishida for over half her life. She had attended 15 years of festivals and memorials and readings from the sutras. She had learned her parishioners' names, greeted their children, and offered condolences at their funerals. Hundreds of people had been her husband's responsibility and hers. She had mastered the routines of this household, changing with the seasons, rushing around in the new year with frozen breath and early aching hands in the early mornings. She had listened to the rain on spring nights when the Mogami River ran so quickly that they could hear it from the temple. She had accepted gifts of summer vegetables on days when tall birds stood still in the fields. She had greeted unexpected visitors, left on trips, and managed all kinds of domestic catastrophes. But with the divorce, those were memories. She would never go back. The only thing she could do, unless she wanted to live in her parents' house forever, was marry again. By this time, her brother Giyu was in charge of things, and he made a good match. She would be married to a peasant nearby this time in the mountain village of Oshima. So her first marriage, she went all the way to Dewa to Oishida. This time she goes much closer to home, just from Ishigami here to Oshima, which is in the mountains. But this marriage, unfortunately, coincided with a disastrous famine. In 1836, after 3 bad harvests in a row, a headman in a village 2 miles away from Oshima panicked. Out of 135 families in his village, he said, 73 had no food. They could try to forage mountain vegetables, kudzu, reeds, and water oats, but in early spring there was still nearly 10 feet of snow on the ground, and the late thaw would make it impossible to gather new leaves in time to stave off starvation. Meanwhile, the families who did still have enough to eat had nothing to give them. At planting time, peasants wouldn't have the money to redeem all the farming tools that they had pawned. Even if they didn't eat their seed rice, they wouldn't be able to plant. It seemed to him as though half the village would starve to death. The following year, 1837, the region as a whole would see the annual death rate nearly triple. And this is something that I wrote in my book, but didn't quite understand the significance of until today when we're living through this pandemic, which has been absolutely horrible. But the annual death rate has not tripled. And if you think of that, living in this tiny village, watching the harvest fail year after year, seeing the death rate triple in the last year of your marriage, I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for Tsuneno and for the peasants, who were more unfortunate, who were her neighbors. In that horrible year, Tsuneno, like many other recent brides, would be divorced, left to make her way back through the haunted, broken countryside and back home to Rinsenji. This is the passage that I showed you before, in which the village headman lamented what had happened in the countryside. And one of the reasons that he wanted to leave this record was to tell the people who came after him, future generations, about what a catastrophe this famine had been, so that nothing like it can ever happen again. And I think of this particular passage often during the many catastrophes we're living through today, about the ways that people write and remember and leave things for future generations, so that we can reflect on what went wrong. This was a serious crisis, not only in this area of the countryside, but throughout Japan. And as we'll see, it did play a role in the political changes that unfolded decades later. But amazingly, in the middle of all of this, Tsuneno's older brother, Giyu, managed to marry her off again for a third time. He even received 4 different marriage proposals in the middle of a disastrous famine. He accepted one, Tsuneno went doing her duty, but that marriage didn't last either. And so Tsuneno was divorced for the 3rd time in 1838 and sent home again, now 34 years old. Giyu, her brother, was undaunted. He made plans to marry her again for a 4th time, to a widower who might not mind an older and extremely opinionated bride. She also was possibly infertile. Tsuneno, as far as we know, never had children. But Tsuneno just could not abide the idea of marrying again. If I stayed at home, Tsuneno wrote later, they were talking about sending me to another terrible place to marry a widower. I was terrified, but I didn't want to marry a widower. I was being forced into something that I just refused to do. She turned down every proposal, and later she described her resistance as a wooden door reinforced with metal, far stronger than it looked. She had another plan, to go to the big city of Edo. She told everyone she wanted to go, but her family would never let her leave. Finally, a man of her acquaintance, a junior priest named Chikan, took her seriously. He said that he had family in Edo and that he would be happy to take her there. So Tsuneno left home, saying she was going to visit one of her brothers, and instead met Chikan on a bridge in the castle town of Takada. This is Takada. This is where she met him, in the neighborhood of Shimogomachi. Chikan said he was about to leave for Edo right away. Tsuneno demurred because she didn't want to leave so soon. He said that was ridiculous. She could pawn the clothes she was carrying for travel money and they should just go. He spoke to her kindly, as if she were a younger sister. All of this she recalled later in her letters. But at the time she stood on the bridge. A few blocks to the south, one of her brothers was waiting with his wife and family, expecting her any minute. To the west was her home, Nineteenth-Century, her family, the endless conversations about marriage, an existence that had become intolerable. And surrounding her were the inns and shops of Takada. This was a neighborhood that catered to travelers, and you can still see some of the original architecture rebuilt and refurbished in this area. Pack horses and travelers crossed this bridge. Everyone was somewhere to go, and beyond them was the northeastern countryside, the fields and mountains where Tsuneno had spent half her lifetime. I imagine that she must have considered her past in that moment. 35 years of tar-black nights, blinding sunshine on snow, and thick icicles like giant white radishes hanging to dry. How many more years did she have left? And so she handed her clothes to Chikan, and he found a man to take them to the pawn shop. And then they left, went down the highway past Mount Yoko, the furthest, highest peak on the horizon of her childhood, and headed to the great city of Edo. Tsuneno's experience in Edo is at the heart of my book. Most of you are probably familiar with Tokyo, but far fewer people in the United States have ever even heard of Edo, its early modern progenitor. But in 1800, Edo had about 1.2 million people, far more than London's 800,000, and about on par with Beijing's 1.1 million. Then, as now, it was the biggest metropolitan area in the world. And as Tsuneno was about to discover, it wasn't an easy place to live. And here I'm going to read a little bit from the book while also showing you images of some of the museum reconstructions that give you an idea of what this life might have looked like. And no immediate prospect of the job, Tsuneno could not do much in her first days in Edo. It was hard enough just to get her bearings. From the main streets of Inner Kanda, the order of the city was comprehensible. It looked more or less like it did on printed maps, a series of blocks divided from one another by gates and fencing. But the back alleys were different, dark and unpredictable, as if the passages between the store's facades led to an entirely different world. Tsuneno walked down pathways so narrow that the eaves of facing buildings nearly touched. Two adults could pass one another, but if one of them happened to be a peddler with baskets slung over his shoulders, then the other would have to step aside. Below her feet, uneven flagstones were set into the packed dirt. Along the row houses, sliding door followed sliding door. On the walls and gates, there was a confusing proliferation of signs. A notice for an employment office, a flyer for a play, a reminder to be careful with fire, an advertisement for a patent medicine that was good for hemorrhoids. None of them looked official, and they obviously weren't permanent. Some were worn away and half torn down. It was clear that there was no plan at work. None of the paths seemed to go very far before they stopped and veered off at right angles. Then there would be a new series of doors and a new series of bewildering signs, or suddenly a tall storehouse belonging to someone on the main street. Sometimes the wells and outhouses were set out haphazardly in the middle of the pathways, but sometimes they occupied their own little clearing alongside an overflowing trash box. These were the only places where it was possible to look up and see more than a sliver of sky. But it was better to keep looking down. There were plants, baskets, toddlers, and dogs underfoot, and the ground was wet where people had been doing their laundry. It seemed that no one made any distinction between indoor and outdoor space. Tools, noises, and smells spilled out onto the pathways, and people conducted their personal business in plain sight. They went to and from the bathhouses nearly naked, and since some of the outhouses had only half doors, men urinated while talking to their neighbors. It was obvious in the middle of this chaos that Tsuneno was in Edo. Where else would be this crowded and loud? But it was hard to tell exactly where she was or how to get out. Was this what Tsuneno had come all the way from Edo to see? Chigo to see. Chikan didn't care. He was almost out of money. At least that was his story. And this was the only part of the city that he could afford. The room he rented was a 3-mat, only 6 feet wide and 9 feet long. A very tall man could have grazed both walls with his fingertips, and 2 adults could barely set out their futons side by side. Even the next size up, a 4.5 mat, was unbearably cramped for more than one person. A few decades before Tsuneno arrived in the city, the writer Shite Samba joked, "They say that someone who lives in a 4.5 tatami room is like an inchworm, all bunched up now so they can stretch out later." This implied a kind of ambition on the part of Edo's tenement dwellers who could endure discomfort in the hope of upward mobility. But in Tsuneno's case, the 3-mat room was the opposite. It was the end of a precipitous downward slide. It was the smallest and probably the filthiest place that she had ever lived. From the packed dirt entryway was just about big enough to hold 2 pairs of sandals. There was a step up into the main room. Inside, there was 1 tatami mat lengthwise, and then beyond it, 2 more stretching side by side toward the back wall. Otherwise, the room was bare. Tenements didn't typically come furnished. And there was no room for furniture anyway. If Tsuneno had extra clothes, which she didn't, she would have to hang them on the walls or stack them in baskets. If she had a futon, which she didn't, she would have to roll it up and shove it in the corner. During the day, this one room would need to be the living and eats, and it wasn't pleasant. The only light came from a window facing forward into the alley. Since most tenement houses consisted of 2 rows of units facing opposite directions, both the side and back walls were shared with other units. The sun would have to be at exactly the right angle for light to fall through the slatted window. The back of the room was sunk permanently in shadow. Beside the room's entrance on the same level, there was a tiny wooden-floored space for holding water buckets. Next to it was the place for cooking, too small to be called a proper kitchen. It would fit a miniature charcoal brazier and maybe a box of rice. There wasn't room to cook more than a pot of rice at a time, so everything would have to be prepared well in advance or bought ready-made from peddlers. And the brazier would need accessories. After the charcoals inside were lit, Tsuneno would need to use a pipe to blow on them to get them to ignite. All of these things, the brazier, the pots, the pipe, the charcoal, and the boxes and buckets would have to be purchased. There were shelves on the wall next to the door, which would be useful if she ever had dishes, trays, and chopsticks. They couldn't be set on the floor. In a 3-mat, there was barely enough room for one person to crouch next to the brazier. Much later, Tsuneno would become accustomed to life in Edo's back alleys. She would get to know her neighbors and learn how to ignore the loud arguments that echoed through the walls. She would figure out how to stand in line at the well, how to share a toilet with dozens of strangers, and how to buy charcoal by the scoop. She would even come to prefer life in the city to her more comfortable existence in Echigo. But during her first weeks in Minagawa-cho, she could barely describe her situation except to say how awful it was. Tsuneno was probably worse off than most of her neighbors, men and women who belonged to the more stable part of Edo's lower class. A few worked as servants who didn't live in, and others were palanquin bearers who propped up their palanquins outside their doors when they weren't working. More were peddlers. They departed every morning, far more cheerfully on sunny days than on rainy ones. For hours, they made their rounds, selling things like candles, sweets, or hot peppers. Other alley dwellers used their tiny rooms for commerce. Sellers of used dishes set them out by the door. Teachers had pupils come in and set up their own desks, and employment agents entertained walk-in clients. But most of the tenement people were small-scale artisans. It was amazing how many different kinds of things they could fabricate in their back alley rooms. People were dyeing and stenciling cloth and carving woodblocks for printing. They were making wooden tools and eyeglasses. They were weaving tatami mats and smoothing boards and assembling musical instruments. They did all of this in full view of the alley with their sliding doors thrown open to catch the light. These busy people kept tabs on their neighbors. They gathered around the well, at the bathhouse, at the barber. They even chatted across the alleys while they were working. Men flung boasted insults back and forth in narrow spaces, put upon grandmothers, criticized their daughters-in-law, and pompous old men bored everyone with peevish complaints. There was always something to say. There were people who liked to borrow things and wouldn't return them, whiny, sticky-handed children who wiped their noses on adults' kimono sleeves, no good men who spent all their family's money at brothels, lazy women who made their husbands go fetch water from the well, and haughty girls who criticized their mother's clothes. No one was immune to criticism or exempt from speculation. Uyoin Shi, an Edo samurai, claimed that back alley women couldn't wait until their menfolk left for the day so that they could get together with the other wives in the neighborhood or on the same row and talk about how useless their husbands are. Chikan, Tsuneno's traveling companion, was certainly completely useless. Within weeks, he abandoned her there in Edo, in the small, dirty tenement, with only one gold coin to her name and no clothes because he had pawned all of them and run away with the proceeds. But Tsuneno did find a way for herself in the city, and the story of how she did that, how she went to work as a maidservant in a samurai's mansion, how she then ended up working for the very wealthy man I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, how she married a masterless samurai and ended up living in the scariest place in Edo, which was the Edo City Magistrate's office. All that is the story that I relate in the book. And along the way, this story includes a kabuki actor famous for playing women's roles, an assortment of gangsters, and an intimidating and tattooed Edo City magistrate. And of course, there was always Tsuneno. She was, by her own admission, an extremely bad-tempered person, stubborn and difficult. But that was what it took to make a life in the city, in a time and a place where the odds were always against her. By the time Tsuneno died in 1853, she was a samurai woman and an Edoite through and through. And as she might have seen it, her life wasn't heroic. She didn't leave much behind, only this amazing assortment of letters. She would have thought that because she did not leave children, she and her husband eventually attempted to adopt later on in her life, that this might have made her a failure, that her household never continued, and that her legacy was nothing. But what I argue in my book is that she couldn't see her legacy because it was in itself the great city of Edo, which she had created through her ambition, through her hard work, and through her desire to live someplace different, someplace new, someplace exciting, someplace where she could buy new clothes and live as an anonymous person and not as the daughter of Rinzenji Temple in Ishigami village. And so that is the story that I relate in the book and the conclusion that I draw, which is about how cities are created and about how ordinary women, through doing things that might not seem that important, by buying snacks and hairpins and bolts of cloth and going to the theater and standing around gossiping by the well, how those people, instead of just being kind of bystanders, are the people who are making cities alive. And that the great achievement of the early modern world, which is the flowering of all these amazing global capitals, including places like Edo and including places like London and Paris and Beijing, is not just the work of the famous men who built the buildings or cleared the land or lived in the castles at the center of the cities, but the work of these anonymous people, and especially the work of women. But before I conclude, I want to take you back to the very beginning, because at the end of researching my book, I went to the Nigata Prefectural Archive one last time, just to kind of do some cleanup work and look through a bunch of documents that I thought I might have missed the first time. And mostly I was just calling up kind of random things, and they didn't seem to be very interesting. They were scraps of paper that had been crumpled up and they had maybe one character on them and I didn't know what they were. But I did call up one document that I knew I had missed, which would build itself as the record of Tsuneno's older brother Gyu's birth. And it's this document that I'm showing here, document 1012. And I was just kind of idly flipping through it because it said, Gyu was born in 1800 and these people came to visit the new baby. And these are all the things that they brought with them. And it's enumerating all these presents the baby Gyu received. And I was thinking, well, this is not really that important, but I was dutifully taking pictures. And then I came to this page and I just completely stopped because what this page said was a record of Tsuneno's birth. And there it was, tucked into this longer document that was all about her more important older brother. And it gave me not only her name, but also the day that she was born. And so for the first time, at the very end of the process, I learned Tsuneno's birthday. And I was so moved by this that I started to cry, and I had to turn around and pretend to be looking at all the dictionaries so that I wouldn't cry all over this document. And I was very embarrassed. I was hoping that the archivists wouldn't notice my kind of moment of having a small breakdown. And I was moved not only because I finally knew this very important fact about this woman that I'd been searching for all this time, and I wasn't able to find until that moment, but also because after 10 years of struggle, I could finally read it. And that to me was a triumph. So that is the story that you can find in the book. And that's a little bit of the story about how I wrote the book. And I would be happy, more than happy, to take any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you so much for being here and listening to me today.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Stanley. We already have quite a lot of questions, so both about content and about process. So the first is actually related to what you were just saying. How did this archive come to be maintained? Why is there so much material? Why did the family keep so much material? How much of it is cultural? How much of it is specific to the family? And then as a kind of corollary, as you were going through the materials, what was there, besides finally learning Tsuneno's name and finally learning her birth date, was there another particular thing that just excited you more than anything?
Okay, that's a bunch of questions. And I actually deliberately kept the talk a little bit short so that I could engage with some of these questions and talk more on the cuff, off the cuff, which I think is a little bit more engaging. So there are a number of reasons why there are so many documents. So the big kind of macro reason is that early modern Japan was a very literate society. And people were accustomed to making a lot of copies of things and to keeping a lot of records. And the reason for this was that this was a society that worked basically on precedent. So if you were, for example, a village headman, and you were in charge of everything in your village, from settling kind of adultery cases to talking to people about their taxes, to figuring out, whether two farmers had a dispute over some woodlands or something like that, then you needed to know what had happened 20 or 40 years ago. So you could look back in your records and understand the precedent and say, 20 years ago in this year, we decided that this woodland should be apportioned this way, and that's how I'm settling this case. So what you end up having are these many villages all over Japan, even very small villages like Ishigami, who had a literate class of people. So first the village headmen, and then anybody else who wants to do business in the village, because literacy is power. And so if you want to go to the village headman and present a dispute, you had better bring your own documents with you. And that's why in Japan, we have this vast archive. And this joke always comes to mind that I learned when I was a historian, when I was a graduate student doing research. I was in a seminar about early modern Japanese history, and all of the other PhD students were Japanese, and they were doing their field research, just as I was, to write my dissertation. And they would say, there are only two things that you need to be able to do in order to be a very successful scholar in early modern Japanese history. The first is you need to be able to drive a car. And the second is you need to be able to drink. And the reason for this is because you need to be able to drive your car into the countryside to where these people have these vast numbers of documents in their storehouses. And then you need to be able to take them out drinking so that you can convince them that you are the right person to look at their documents. So while I went to a prefectural archive, there are storehouses all over Japan that are full of these types of things. Now, this particular collection got into this archive probably sometime in the early 20th century, when the temple, for reasons that aren't clear to me, ceased to exist. And what I imagine happened is that this family had boxes and boxes and boxes of paper somewhere in their house, and that they couldn't necessarily read it. I mean, there were thousands of documents in this collection, and as you can see, it looks like squiggles. And even kind of modern Japanese people can't read the handwriting of people from the 19th or the 17th century. And so they probably looked at all this stuff and said, we don't know what to do with this, and they just donated it. So I'm not sure the family actually knew what was in it. And I'm not sure if the family had known what was in it, that they would have actually delivered it to a public archive, because there are a lot of family scandals in these papers. But of course, it's a treasure for a social historian to be able to look through all these letters and papers and files and find these kind of human stories. The next part of that question was what I found that I was most excited about. So the thing that moved me most was finding out Tsuneno's birthday, which I had never known. The detail that kind of jumped out at me and most surprised me was from a time when Tsuneno was living in Edo and working as a maidservant. And I didn't talk about this in the talk, but there was a time when she received a proposal from a masterless samurai who she'd known as a child. He'd grown up in the village next to hers, but she hadn't seen him in something like 20 years. And they met again in Edo, and he said, Tsuneno, I would like you to marry me. Why don't you think about it? We can grow old together and go back to the countryside and kind of enjoy our retirement and die there. So he was making this proposal. And she talked about it, according to her in her letters, with a number of other maidservants who were serving in the same samurai household as she was. And the maidservant said to her, Tsuneno, don't do it. You are getting by fine on your own. And if you work by yourself, you get used to it. You might be poor and you're struggling, but it's something that you're doing for yourself. And if you marry a man, you have to take care of him. And that to me sounded like such a kind of strangely modern thing to say. Like, you can imagine people saying that today, if we're still going out to bars. If you went out to a bar with your girlfriend and are asking for advice about this man, she might say, you're better off without him. I had thought that in an early modern city, any woman would want male companionship and to be protected in that way. But they said, and it turned out that they were right, that it would be easier for her to survive and to work on her own. So that's the thing that I found most striking and most surprising. I had to read it a number of times to make sure that was what they were really saying.
Amazing, thank you. There are a number of questions about divorce, not surprisingly. So can you just tell us a little bit more about divorce in the early modern period? Was it common to be divorced 3 or 4 times? Or did men have to give a reason for divorcing their wives? What was that process and kind of concept like in the early
so I often get this question because it's so surprising, right? We think of early modern societies as being, by our standards, conservative, that marriages would be more binding and more difficult to get out of. And so it often surprises people in Tsuneno's story that she's divorced, 4 times, right? She remarried the same person twice, actually, at the end of her life. And what I say is actually divorce was very common, and here is why. It's because of the way that the Japanese household system is set up. So when I explain this to my students, I like to use the idea of my own children to explain how the household system works. So in general, a family would live with the mother and father and the children and possibly also the grandparents. And the idea was that this household was supposed to move forward in time so that one of the children would inherit the household and then carry on with whatever the family profession was, whether it was making sandals or selling medicine or being a samurai or being a Buddhist priest. So in my case, if we think of it this way, okay, I am a scholar, I'm married to another scholar, I have 2 sons. One of them is going to take over as a scholar and live in our house for the rest of his life with his wife. And the other one has to go someplace else. You know, we'll adopt him out, we'll set him up in a branch house. He'll do something different. He can go sell sandals if he wants. It doesn't matter. But that one son is going to inherit the family name and the house, and he's going to live with us. He also needs to get married because this is a heterosexual system. He's going to bring in a wife. Sometimes you might keep a daughter and bring in a husband, but in most cases it's man, he brings in a wife. And that wife is going to live with us, his parents, and is also going to learn the ways of the household. So that all sounds great. And it makes sense then that the parents want to be involved in choosing who this wife is because she's going to come live with them. But you think about this for a minute and you realize, wait a minute, what if you made a mistake? What if the woman that my son marries is terrible? What if she sleeps late? What if she wastes money? What if she gambles? What if she's an adulterer? What if we just don't like her? What if she yells at everybody? What if she hinders her career? What if she alienates everyone in the village? You need to be able to get rid of her and try again, right? It's almost the rigidity of the household system that makes divorce necessary. So this is a system in which divorce is very common. And it usually happens officially by the husband writing a famous kind of 3.5-line notice of divorce. Now, people have pointed at this and said, you know, how aggressive, just to get rid of a wife, all a man has to do is write 3.5 lines and then she's gone and cast out, and this is terrible. In reality, this was often the product of negotiation between the wife, the husband, the wife's family, the husband's family. And when a woman wanted to divorce herself, she'd often bring in her family to pressure the man to write that 3.5-line document. And the point of that 3.5-line document was so she could take it home with her, and then she could marry again. She could show this document that showed that she had been divorced. And one of the things that document says is, and you're free to marry again. So it's not at all uncommon to see people in this era who were divorced. In fact, most first marriages did not make it. Either somebody died or somebody got divorced, divorce being more common, before they made it 10 years. So this is kind of a standard fact of life. So being divorced once is kind of embarrassing, but really no big deal. Being divorced twice is embarrassing. Being divorced 3 or 4 times becomes a problem, because then people look around and they think there must be something wrong with this woman that she keeps getting sent home. And so it makes sense in Tsuneno's story that as these divorces pile up and she keeps getting sent home, that the pressure on her increases. And of course, the partners that her family can find probably get older and older and less desirable.
Thank you. There are several questions also about literacy. So was it common for women to be literate, to learn how to write? How did the process of learning writing and what was the process for a woman to learn to read and write? Did they learn both hiragana and kanji, both Japanese syllabary and Chinese style or Sino-Japanese characters? Could you speak?
Yes, so that is a really good question. So the first part about how common is it? It's not common in that most women in villages could not write, but a substantial percentage of them could. And if you were kind of in Tsuneno's strata, like of kind of upper middle class people, as we would probably call it today, whose job was education, because Buddhist temples had to do a lot of record keeping and also religious education, it was quite common for women to be taught to write. And in fact, we know that Tsuneno's aunt could write, because we have letters from her aunt in the archive, and also probably that her mother can write, because if I can share this screen again, where I found the document from Tsuneno, this is mostly kana, which I'll get to in a minute, and seems to me like more likely a woman's writing than a man's writing. You can see, let's see if I can get back in, no, I can't, okay. You can often see the difference between women's and men's writing, because men's writing is very blocky and angular. Okay, so here, I'm going to show this again. So when we see these letters, this letter in the background in the dark gray, That is a man's letter, and it's written mostly in the Chinese characters that are borrowed into Japanese that are called kanji, and they're much more kind of complicated and in some ways more difficult to read, although in some ways kind of easier to read. So I think that women and men, boys and girls, would have been taught to write at the beginning of their education in much the same way, using very simple textbooks that taught them how to write kana, which is the syllabary. So every kind of syllable has its own character. The characters don't convey a meaning apart from the way they sound. And then the education would branch off, and women would be taught things that were considered more suitable to women, such as household education and poetry, whereas men would have to learn, so I talk about this in the book, Tsuneno's brother Gyu, who is growing up to be a Buddhist priest, would have had to learn some doctrine, but he would also have to learn how to compose letters that would go to the authorities. So he'd have to kind of learn how the language of business. And the language of business was actually a different written language that borrowed very heavily from Chinese and used a lot of Chinese characters. And this is why Tsuneno's letters and her brother's letters look entirely different, so that at a glance you can say, this is Tsuneno's and this is Gyu's. They don't look anything alike. Now, about reading them though, Tsuneno's letters can be more difficult because the kana, each character that represented a sound, could be written in any number of ways, and it wasn't consistent. And so there was just the kind of figuring out, this is called hentai kana, the different forms that the kana could take. But then also, because Tsuneno wrote phonetically, it was difficult to figure out where the words began and ended, where the phrases began and ended, and also literally what she meant, because she also spoke in dialect, and she wrote down the way she thought things sounded. So the best example of this is my mother is a first grade teacher in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia has a very distinct accent in which people say, when they say they saw things, it sounds more like Saul. And so the students in her first grade class often, instead of writing I saw S-A-W, will write I saw S-O-L-L, because that is how the word saw sounds to them. And Tsuneno often did the same thing. So instead of saying she was going to Edo, which is the way that we would pronounce the term in kind of standard Japanese, she says she's going to Ido, because in Echigo dialect, the E's and the A's were fungible. And so to me, reading this, 200 years later, Ido means well. She was going to a well. What is she talking about? And so part of the kind of process of reading these letters was looking up phrases in an Echigo dialect dictionary. And then also I'm talking to people who are from Echigo and saying, oh yes, we like to joke that Echigo, Ichigo, Echigo and strawberry are kind of the same word, because we switch around our E's and our S's. And so that was what allowed me to make sense of it. But yes, it was a difficult struggle to make sense of actually any of it.
Do you have any tips on learning Kuzushiji, the classical?
Any tips on learning Kuzushiji? So Kuzushiji is the destroyed style of calligraphy that everybody was writing in the 19th century. In fact, it's quite standard. And even across different regions of Japan, people use the same forms of the letters, of the characters, even though they look just kind of like squiggles to us. So I will give you an example of how you do this. So I think I can. Okay, so this is my dictionary for Kuzushiji. And the way it works is that it gives you, let's see, let's find a good character. That's kind of a simple one. It gives you a character that you might find very commonly in Japanese in its kind of printed form that you can read if you read Japanese. And then it gives you a list of all the ways that that character might get messed up in a document. And so this will give you this idea, if you see a squiggle, it might be this character that is recognizable. But the problem is, of course, that you don't have the character in the first place. So how do you know what the squiggle is going to resolve into? Well, that is how you do that is you look at the parts of the squiggle and you're like, okay, the left side kind of looks like a check mark. That means the water radical. So then you go through this dictionary and you look at everything that has a check mark on the side and see what your personal squiggle looks like. There's also this way to do it, which is that once you've learned the kind of rhythm of the language, and you know enough about the context, you get to a point, this is where I always get stuck, where you can read like 90% of it and it's that last 10% that you can't read, but it's that last 10% of it that's also really important because those are the characters that don't come up all the time. So it's that kind of, you're just completely blocked. So for me, kind of what I do with that is you kind of have to imagine like a puzzle. If this character is here and then there's a blank that I can't read and this character comes here, what is the character that's going to come between those two? And so there are all sorts of ways to do this. I like to, this is getting incredibly technical, but I like to look in the dictionary, there are online dictionaries of compound words. And if you know the second character, what could be the first character, and then go through and look at it that way. But yes, I could talk about this all day. It's fascinating to me. It's like a puzzle. And it was one of the most irritating and time consuming, but also one of the most fun parts of doing the research was to work out what all this calligraphy was.
Great. A much simpler question. What was Tsuneno's birthday?
Tsuneno's birthday. Let me go back to, because I know it's the 3rd month, but I can never remember the day. It is the 3rd month and the 12th day. So on Tsuneno, that resolves into a different day in the Western calendar, but I put it on my calendar on March 12th every year, just in case.
Let's see. How did Tsuneno deal with travel restrictions?
So this is a good question. So technically, women were not allowed to travel in the Edo period unless they had a special pass. And this pass would be issued from the samurai authorities who controlled the area that the woman was from. And so there are all these checkpoints along the roads where women would have to present this pass and then be inspected. And it was quite a thorough inspection under the clothes and in the hair. They had special women inspectors to do this. And the reason was for national security, basically. So the shogunate, which was based in Edo Castle, was very concerned about rebellions from regional lords. And they thought that if regional lords were going to rebel, the first thing they would do is try to get all of their women out of Edo, because there was a law, a law that said that these regional lords had to leave their wives and firstborn children in Edo as hostages. And so if there was going to be a rebellion, first they would get all the women out and then they would send guns in, was the idea, or weapons in, but including guns because they did have guns at this point. So the shogunate had these very strict rules about the fact that women then had to be inspected, particularly on the highways that led out of Edo. And it was this kind of incredibly ritualized experience by the end of the Tokugawa period. And the penalties for being a woman trying to sneak through the checkpoints were quite terrible, including death. So in kind of theory, Tsuneno should not have been able to run away from home with no pass. But in practice, women often went around these barriers. And I talk about in the book the different ways that people could do this. One way is they could hire a local guide who would take them through the villages surrounding the checkpoint and tramping through rice fields and whatever. The problem was you would have to pay the guide could cheat you. The peasants in the villages were often resentful of, these random travelers kind of trampling through their fields. But at one of the checkpoints that Tsuneno went through that I describe in the book, it was known for having a dog door. And so after hours, women would sneak through the dog door. Now, how did they not catch them? Well, the thing is that nobody actually cared. So people did care about high-ranking samurai women because they really posed a threat and could signal that this rebellion was happening. Nobody by the end of the Tokugawa period really cared about commoner women traveling back and forth. So it was a kind of look the other way type of situation. And I assume that she and Chikan hired a guide to take them around the checkpoint that was in their way.
Do you mind taking 2 more questions?
Of course.
So first, did your study of Tsuneno change? In what ways did your study of Tsuneno's life change how you understand Edo period Japan? What changed for you from this project?
I think a number of things changed for me. There are kind of 2 different questions. One is what changed for me, and then the other is kind of what I wanted to change for other people who read the book. So what changed for me was that I was really, again, I would say, startled by how direct she was in the way that she expressed herself. So I had learned in kind of my academic study that women's letters are very lyrical, that they make a lot of poetic allusions, that they are indirect, that they use these kind of set phrases, that they're incredibly polite, and that this is the way that women kind of express themselves in general. I did not find any of that here. I don't think Tsuneno ever quoted a poem in her entire life. You know, her letters say, I want my stuff, send it here. Or they say, I wanted to die, or they're, angry, or they're contrite. I hate my husband. She was very forceful in the way that she expressed herself. And it made me think that the conventional wisdom about Japanese women of this era, we knew, of course, because people are people, that they're diverse and have all kinds of personalities. But the idea was once they expressed themselves in writing, that they adhered to a rigid form. And I found through this study that was not true at all. And so that's what most surprised me. But what I wanted other people to start thinking about, what I wanted to surprise them, both for people who don't know anything about Japan and the Edo period and for people who are specialists, is the idea that it actually is possible to write a history of the city of Edo or of the Edo period from the perspective of a commoner woman. Because so much history of this era has been written as the history of men, sometimes as the history of elite men, sometimes as the history of the masses of commoner men. And the excuse that people often offer for this is it's just impossible to know about women and what they were thinking because they just didn't leave that many documents. It's too bad. But I hope that I've shown with this book that this is not true at all. And in fact, I think that there are hundreds of other Tsunenos waiting to be discovered and many other stories of women in this era that can be told.
And what's your next project?
Oh my goodness. So I am currently homeschooling two of my children who have to go to school on Zoom for the last 8 months. So for most of the time, I am stuck in my basement and I am not doing any work at all, which really hurts me because I love to work and to study and to write. But like many other women during this pandemic, that really just has not been possible for me. And so I am in the process of kind of thinking about what to write next. And as I was saying when we were talking before this symposium started, I'm really actually interested in this house that they're building at the Huntington. I think there's a story there. So I would love to go to Marugame, where the house comes from, and find out about this family and look at all their documents. So maybe that will be next, or maybe it will be something else entirely. I just don't know.
Do you mind taking one more?
Of course.
There was a question about your choice of translation and converting dates. So how did you decide when to translate something like Ronin into one, masterless warrior, rather than keeping a relatively well-known Japanese word in the original? And then what was your thinking about converting times and dates?
So my thinking about this book was that I should translate every single thing. So I translate even things that people usually leave untranslated. So for example, the currency, the ryo and the bu, etc. I translate ryo as gold pieces, bu as gold coins. And the reason for this is I often think that reading a bunch of italicized foreign words takes people out of the narrative if they're not already very familiar with Japan. People have enough trouble keeping the names straight. And so I didn't want to put up additional barriers. I wanted them to feel like they were in the middle of a kind of fluid narrative and one that they could understand and relate to. And so I didn't want that level of kind of like distance in between the reader and the world. Now there are trade-offs of that because all words are not translatable, right? And so, some of them like cho, which I translate city block, that is a contested translation. Ronin, masterless samurai, is also a weird translation because not all people who called themselves Ronin actually were masterless samurai. And in Tsuneno's husband's case, he really wasn't a samurai at all. He was kind of like a fake wannabe samurai. But then when you get to like a level of that kind of detail, like what even is a samurai? So you can really do that endlessly. And my idea was I'm just pick a translation that I think is good and I'm just going to stick with it. And hopefully scholars will forgive me.
Thank you. So there are many, many comments thanking you for your fascinating talk and
Oh,
expressing
thank you.
excitement about reading your book. So where can we get your book?
You can get my book anywhere. You can get it on Amazon if you need to. You can get it on Bookshop. You can get it at your bookstore. You can get it at your library. Luckily, this is a very easy book to get. So please, yes, go out and get it from your library or buy it. I would be delighted.
Well, thank you so, so much for your talk and for sharing this wonderful story with us. And I at least will very much look forward to bringing you back for the symposium about the Japanese house, hopefully in a year or two. Just one final thing, our lecture, the East Asian Garden lecture series will continue in the spring. Because of the pandemic, we still have a little bit of trouble confirming everything, but we should have a talk on Thursday, January 21st. And in the meantime, the director of our botanical gardens, Jim Folsom, will be talking about why gardens and botany matter in a conversation with the president of the Huntington, Karen Lawrence, on December 2nd. So we hope to see you then and then again in the spring. And please join me in thanking Professor Stanley again for her wonderful talk.
Thank you, everybody.